Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Sacramental Charismatic, the podcast exploring the intersection of sacramentality, missiology, pneumatology, ecclesiology, and then basically whatever else decides to get talked about. My name is Luke Garrity, and I'm the host, and I'm really excited about today's conversation with Susan Van Riesen, who is the lead pastor of the Palo Alto Vineyard. So Bay Area. Susan, it is so great to finally have a chance to sit down and do a podcast with you.
Thanks, Luke.
Welcome. So how are you doing?
Good.
Yeah?
Good.
You're hanging in there?
I am.
Yeah.
Definitely.
It's kind of funny when you think about that answer, how you generally, it seems like people say, I'm okay. I'm okay. Yeah. So, hey, for our listeners, so I know there's people in the Vineyard movement that are familiar with you, but people outside of the Vineyard, or maybe perhaps, who are in the Vineyard, but maybe live on the East Coast or the Midwest, who maybe haven't had a chance to interact with you, maybe what are a couple of things that are important to know about you that would help people kind of maybe situate you and your background and whatnot. We'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Before I came on staff at the Vineyard, I was a staff member with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship for 16 years in Southern California and here in Northern California. And I was a full-time mom for 8 years. And then I've been on staff at our church in various roles, but lead pastor for 3 years.
Awesome. Cool. That's awesome. I've actually had the chance to go down to your church building in the Palo Alto area, and we got to eat Indian food, which as I told you in our emails, like I constantly think about that. I'm always like, I wish we lived in Palo Alto. That Indian food is amazing. So you worked in college ministry in a quote unquote parachurch ministry for quite some time, and I think that probably gives you somewhat of a unique perspective from a ministry side of things, because you were in a college university setting. So you probably saw a pretty big shift culturally over the course of that time. Would that be, or was it already kind of leaning towards postmodernity and, maybe less Christian as culture?
Yeah. I mean, the college I went to for undergrad myself was a very postmodern place anyways, and Occidental College in Southern California. So I think by the time I got into ministry, it was definitely a postmodern scene.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. I like that. I've always found talking to people who worked in the college campuses to be like 10 years ahead of the game. Like, teach me your ways. What are you dealing with? Because we're going to have that happen here. That's great. Well, so I'd love to talk a little bit about your experience as a woman in leadership. I think also, being a woman of color, what that's been like, and just what's your experience been? Because I know we both have come to a biblical, theological, and pastoral position of being egalitarians and seeing that women are invited to serve in any area of leadership. But there's still the consequences of the cultural, allure that's been out there. And even in the movement that we're a part of, I know that we have egalitarian framework, or it's allowed, and it's encouraged in many ways. But there's also been times where it doesn't feel like, we're as maybe progressive, or we haven't enacted that as much as we would want to see, or at least that's my experience. I'd love to hear, like, what's been your experience, and how has being a woman in leadership in a lead pastor role, what's that been like? Both the positive and maybe, also the parts that you want to poke somebody's eyes out. I know you would never want to poke anybody's eyes out because you're nice, but I would.
Overall, it's been really good. It's been surprisingly encouraging and supportive. When I transitioned from being a co-lead pastor with my husband to being the sole lead pastor. I really don't think we lost anyone in our church.
Awesome.
And there are even some people who either are, what do they call it? Mildly complementarian.
Yeah.
But
soft complementarian.
Yeah, that's right. But they still were like, Susan, we trust you and we believe that the Holy Spirit is on you for leadership in our church. So how they pulled that together, I'm not sure, but I just really felt the support of my church.
Yeah.
So, and I really felt like God did a number of things in that first year, especially to confirm that he was going to really help me. And it didn't have to be this way, but I felt like God was saying, I'm going to make this good and smooth for you.
Okay.
And I felt like that happened.
Gotcha. Did you grow up, did you grow up in church, so to speak? And if so, did you grow up, holding to an egalitarian perspective, or did you kind of transition into that later in life?
I grew up in a Korean Presbyterian church in Eugene, Oregon. It's really small, probably more like a PCA church.
Okay.
So women could be elders and deacons, but they couldn't preach or be a pastor.
Yeah. They couldn't be teaching elders or.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. So that was the environment you grew up in. And then what kind of caused that shift, that story to change a little bit in your own personal framework, so to speak, or your own personal convictions?
I don't think that the gender dynamics of my small conservative Korean church background were really convictions of my own.
Okay.
So
gotcha.
It's just what I grew up with and what got modeled to me, but I don't think I internalized those things.
Yeah.
And I didn't really live out my faith until college anyway, very much. So in college, I connected with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which is definitely very egalitarian.
Yeah.
So as are most campus ministries, or many. So
yeah, even the ones for denominations that are complementarian, if you go to there, that's always the interesting thing. That's interesting.
They're not pastors, so it's okay.
Exactly. It's like, we're just playing semantics now because you do all the pastor things. But yeah, so that background was not something you embodied or really found as a conviction. It just was what you were in.
Yeah.
And so did you already I guess, how did you wrestle with that? Or maybe it hasn't been a wrestle, maybe it's been something that, but how did you come to the point where you were, I guess, not only, because I think something I really appreciate about you, Susan, is that you're not just a egalitarian, like, hey, I believe that women can, but you seem to be you're an advocate. When you every time you write anything, I've ever seen anything you write or interact on social media, I just really think that you measure your words in a way that is thoughtful. And then also it seems to be like wanting to stimulate people moving in a very kingdom oriented trajectory. So did that develop at all, or was that just kind of who you are?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'm guessing that in my time in InterVarsity as a student and at Occidental College, there was a lot of values for justice and advocacy and voice and speaking up for marginalized people. But I think that my experience as a Korean American was probably more a part of that than my experience as a woman. Although that's definitely in there as well. But I think when I came back into church ministry, there was a sense of like, oh yeah, this issue, is this going to be a problem? And it wasn't really, it wasn't a huge problem. So when my husband became the lead pastor, our family situation was that, I had a one special needs child and then two kids who were 1 year minus 3 days apart. So at that point I was like, you know what? I don't really care whether our church will allow for a woman in the lead pastor role, because I'm not interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and when our founding pastor left, the board at that time decided that they would not take applications from women. So,
wow.
Yeah, that was just, I guess that was annoying and interesting to me, but I was like, okay, whatever. So my husband did apply, and he got the position, but as he entered into the role, he told our board that his vision, our vision, ultimately, when we were ready, that we would ultimately like to lead together. That was our vision for us as a family and as a couple. And so we just kind of lived in the tension of that and felt like, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And then eventually, as our family situation stabilized, we did take the role together as co-lead pastors. And that by that time was fine with everyone in leadership. And then when it was time for my husband to take on the role of the more time parent, that was fine with everyone too. So everyone, on our board and in the leadership of our church. Yeah. So I feel like that God has really rolled that carpet out in a good way.
Mm-hmm. So how long ago, if you don't mind me asking, how long ago was it that the church would say, hey, we aren't going to take applications from female? Was that 10 years ago, 15 years ago?
Maybe 12, 13 years ago.
Okay.
When the former lead pastor was leaving.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think he felt that way, and a number of other board members felt that way.
Yeah.
But then there was a natural transition.
And the Vineyard at that time was still kind of coming to terms with that around that time. I think that was a little bit after that, perhaps, when the Vineyard USA.
No, it was before then.
It was, okay. Because was it 2006, maybe? 2000.
I can't remember.
4, 3. Yeah, I can't remember. I just remember when they had the letter come out, and it was like, we've decided, but you don't have to go by it.
Right. So I was like, okay.
Yeah, I was like, I don't understand. So we aren't, or we are. But well, that's interesting. I think that's probably pretty common for a lot of soft complementarians, at least. Because that's kind of my story. I was so it's funny you were in a PCA. I went to a Presbyterian seminary. I have a lot of Reformed tradition, influences in some ways. So, but I would have defined myself, I don't know, a soft complementarian for a long time. I didn't really have a problem with women preaching, and I was really wrestling with two texts of Scripture, the two texts that everybody wrestles with. And I just had not, I hadn't encountered a whole lot of really solid biblical scholarship at the time. That was my common experience. I just read like books would be given to me from an egalitarian perspective, and they were very practical, and they really highlighted the challenges from an individual perspective, but they just did not really convince me biblically or theologically. So it wasn't until a few years later when I started wrestling with some really good scholarship where I was like, okay, there's really good reasons to have an egalitarian perspective on gender issues and leadership. But I also want to say that what was a really convincing thing for me was seeing it modeled too. I mean, I woke up one day and I realized that I've got 5 sisters. My mom has been an amazing spiritual leader in my life. I have 5 sisters. I also incidentally have 3 daughters and my wife, and our churches have always had lots of female leaders who were very gifted, very capable. And so when I started seeing it modeled more, it was like, it just like all those pieces fell together. So I think that's an interesting thing for like in your church community. It starts out, yeah, no. And then it's like, oh, maybe. And then it's like, yeah, that's kind of I don't know. It's a kind of a gracious way of doing it too, I think, because it gives people, that's the challenge, like giving people the space to process through some of these really challenging topics, like if you're a diehard complementarian and you've been told your whole life that being a complementarian is a progressive, non-valuing the Bible perspective, I mean, it's no wonder that people are a little suspicious of other perspectives. But if you allow them to ask questions and process it, there can be positive fruit. Not always, but it seems like that's kind of cool to see that process though modeled out too. And that's something that I hadn't valued that as much before, I think, because I had this like rigid, it has to be the Bible, just show me the Bible verses and help me exegete them correctly. But I underestimated, I think, that model. And that's something I think that's really fascinating about women in ministry too. And I'd love to have you comment on this. Is like, I always tell people, my wife, she's not a real fan of speaking. Like, she doesn't really like, Dawn, you met Dawn. She's not a fan of it. Like, she's like, I would not choose that to be the thing I do. But she has a lot of, and I would use the word authority. Another word might be influence. When she speaks, because she brings something completely different to the table than I do. And so when she's sharing and she's speaking, it's like, I don't know, it has a different, well, it's the other side. We have to have those different perspectives. And so, like, have you found that to be true too, that, in your own experience, people, like, they heard your sermons and they started seeing how, oh, you're leading differently than past pastors have, and you do it in a more, I don't know, like, it's like it convinces them. Has that been a big part of the story too, where that you said earlier, they saw, in a sense, like evidence of God's work in your life, or there was positive things in the ministry, and that was what kind of sold them? I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but you know what I mean.
What I'm realizing is that even though I came from a functionally complementarian background in terms of the Korean church, I think I mostly thought about that as Korean culture, because it's just more patriarchal.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So I didn't really think of it, and I wasn't a seminarian at the time. I was just a kid, but I thought of it as just, that's how Korean culture is. It's just more gender segregated, and the men have the leadership roles, but we didn't really, no one was having the conversation like, what does the Bible say about that? It was just kind of taken for granted. And I think it was more in the culture bucket for me. So I don't think I ever struggled with like, wow, is this okay? And a new world or something like that. I just went to a college where there's half the professors are women, and of course half the staff workers are women, and then just, it was just natural. So it was almost like when we had the meeting where our former lead pastor announced that they would only be taking applications from men for the lead pastor role. We were like, oh, that's whatever. That's weird.
Are they Korean? Are they Korean?
Exactly. I didn't hear Korean.
Exactly. You look white to me, but it's funny.
I mean, I definitely think I have encountered more complementarian church cultures along the way since then, since I've been immersed in more church ministry rather than campus ministry. But the complementarian thing makes so little sense in college ministry, when you're like, my professors are women, administrators are women, and wait, what? Like, women can't lead Bible study? Okay. That's just weird. So
well, it's like you said, the word functional, that's a good word to use when you talk about this a little bit, because that's what I found so fascinating. When I was transitioning from this soft complementarianism to the egalitarian perspective, which for our listeners, I should just say, like, the common egalitarian perspective is that leadership's not based off of gender, but it's based off of calling and gifting. So it's not that every man shouldn't be a leader or every woman should be a leader. It's about gifting. And so the primary question is like, hey, are you called, and has God gifted you? And do you have the character? Do you have, the questions are not what is your gender, when you come to this. But when I was coming to that, what I found really fascinating is, as I was processing this, because we were in pastoral ministry in the last church, I was the senior pastor, lead pastor, and my wife was pastor's wife, or whatever. And so, and yet my wife is way more pastoral than I am, but by leaps and bounds. And so people would say, oh no, we totally think that she does pastoral ministry, and she's definitely gifted with pastoral gifting, but she can't be the senior pastor. And I remember I was like, that does not make sense to me. That's like, weird. At all. Like, there's not can you say that one more time for yourself to understand how inconsistent that perspective is? That's fascinating. Like how your college experience, and maybe just be in wrestling with the cultures, you just kind of assumed that was a a Korean cultural thing, and then you didn't really discover that it was an actual issue maybe until later when you started interacting with more church people. You're like, oh,
yeah. I mean, theoretically, I knew that it was a conversation, but it wasn't a conversation that I was like super engaged with. And we did some teaching about this in college ministry because students were coming from all sorts of different kinds of church backgrounds, so I wrestled with it more over the shoulder or like secondarily. And I think as a campus minister, I didn't always love being on the forefront of that conversation because it felt like self-advocacy, And so if they were students who were like, prove to me that it's okay, then I'd be like, could we have a brother do this? A brother who is also egalitarian? Because it's just weird to advocate for your,
We got to talk more about this. This is okay. I need. I think this is a good topic because the concept of allies in any. I mean, we've seen that with, especially with ethnic diverse conversations, racism, systemic oppressions, all the things that have been raised, actually raised to the perspective of a group of people in America who have been kind of oblivious to it because a lot of other people have been like, hey, this is real. It's been real for a long time. But you hear more talking about allies. And like, I remember I was having a conversation with somebody who was basically like grilling an African-American friend of mine for like, basically, give me evidence that these things. And I was like, hey, dude, I don't think that this African-American person should have to tell you about racism and educate you because they've been doing that their whole lives. And maybe you could do a Google search and read some books or, that seems really mean. But on the other hand, I also am like, there are some people who and I know that maybe this is just different gifting and different perspectives, but there are people who feel like it's part of their calling to help educate people about their ethnic issues or so they don't have a problem with saying, hey, I'd love to help you as a white person become more aware of the challenges that I have faced or that people of color face. So it's like both of those perspectives to me are valid. I agree. So a lot of times it's like us just self-differentiating where I don't want to do that or I would like to do that, But with the issue of allies, like talk a little bit more about that because I tend to agree with you that especially men should be speaking up about some of these issues because I think it is important to be an ally. But on the other hand, the two things that I'm kind of wondering is number one, it's like, again, it kind of models patriarchy though? It's like the man. You know what I mean? I'm like, it's ironic to me that I'm like, hold on, let me mansplain.
Right.
Explain to you why it's okay for Susan.
That's
so that's
true.
Number one. And then number two, with the ally issue or challenge is it seems like there's an attitude amongst some people where it's almost an anti-intellectual thing. And I remember I've encountered this a lot. I was trying to seriously wrestle with the data. And I remember multiple people almost just saying like, we don't theologies, you can't never know. And the Bible's not that. It was like this real anti-intellectual perspective. I don't think they meant to do that, but like, I don't really care about all the theology. I just know in my heart.
Right.
I'm not throwing shade, but it's for me, I was like, that doesn't do anything. Like I need someone to speak up and so I've participated in different events on the subject of women in ministry. And there's always like 2 or 3 women that hold a perspective like that, where they don't want to really talk about the scholarship. And I don't know if it's because of their insecurity of maybe they don't know it. And that's totally fine, but like, let's not throw shade on or like demean or minimize the importance of, being your own ally would be my thought. So like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I tend to agree with you. Like maybe you shouldn't have had to, get up there and tell InterVarsity, like, this is why I'm in leadership. But at the same time too, do you feel like it's important for you to be able to do that? Or did you ever have to do that? And did you see fruit of that? Comment on all that. I know it's a lot, but I just want to flesh out allies.
I have a funny story. So I think sometime in the first year that I was the lead pastor at our church, a friend of a friend contacted me, and his church, which had been complementarian since the time it started, had just lost their lead pastor, and they were in the middle of a pastor search. And someone raised the issue like, hey, we've only ever had male pastors, but are we open to having women apply for this position? And they were like, oh, not really. And they were kind of wrestling with, well, why not? Is this something that we really own? And so they decided to put that on the table. And it was an all-male elders team. So I guess in order to be a pastor, you had to be on the elders team, and the elders team was all men. So anyways, they wanted to come to a new conclusion, and they really wanted to look at the scriptures again. So they decided, we want to find a church that we identify with. They were non-denominational evangelical. And so they decided to find an evangelical pastor who is a man who's complementarian, and an evangelical pastor who's a woman who's egalitarian. And so they reached out to me, and I had only been in the role for a year. And they said, so we would like you to come and lead our elders team in a Bible study. And we're going to have the other guy come and do that too. And would you do this? And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. What, that just sounds like, do I want to stick my head in a blender? Yeah. I don't think so. Just like, I'm so busy. I have so many things to do. Why would I do this?
There's Indian food right down the road. Why would you not just go eat Indian food every day? That's what I would do for you. So I got that.
So I said, oh, well, I'm just going to send Alex. He's had and my husband, he's had a bunch of these conversations, but they didn't really want Alex. They wanted me to come.
Yeah.
And Alex said to me, yeah, you're kind of like a unicorn, Oh, and this church was an Asian American church. So I'm an Asian American woman lead pastor, in a local church. And he said, yeah, you're like a unicorn. They want to see if you really exist, an Asian American woman lead pastor. So, Alex said, I think you should just pray about it. So I prayed about it, and, I was just going to do the perfunctory prayer. But then I felt the Lord saying, what if I have a little girl in that church who I've gifted to be a leader or pastor, and it would really help them to have a role model? And why don't you just go and do this? So I was like, okay, fine. So I went, and I was nervous to meet with the elders, all the male elders. And I actually took Alex with me, not to be my covering, but just to be my partner. And he was like, oh, yeah, I'm so excited. And, he's just great at connecting. And he just became everyone's best friend. And, he said, they asked him, of course, how is it for you to be the spouse of a woman who's lead pastor? And he's like, I love it. I love that my wife is happily using her gifts for the kingdom. I think this is awesome. And this is even better for us than when I was lead pastor. And, he was just super enthusiastic. And I did do the theological conversation, the scripture study. They actually had me come and lead the whole congregation in a Bible study as well. And the other pastor had come and the week before. And, the elders team voted unanimously that they would change to be egalitarian. Wow. And the majority of the congregation voted to switch to be egalitarian as well. Wow. And now they have a co-lead pastor team of a man and a woman who are not married to each other. And the woman who's on that team is a acquaintance of mine. And I'm just so thrilled that they've made this change. And it sounds like it's been really great for that church. But it was good for me to go and have the conversations, and either out of avoidance or laziness to not just avoid it, or just be like, oh, that's an unpleasant self-advocating conversation that I don't want to have. I'll send my husband, But to be like, no, I can be a part of this.
Yeah. So in that case, it's not that you can't advocate for yourself or be your own ally or argue for, the perspective convincingly, I might add, because you worked. It worked.
Hold on, I'm sorry. My AirPods are not working. So I'm going to have to.
That's totally okay. take your time, do whatever you got to do. This is like those podcasts where I had said when I first started that there might be kids running around at times. It's totally okay. So I can't hear you, but you can hear me maybe.
What's that?
Good. I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I'm back.
Good. Okay, cool. Yeah, we can edit if we need to, but I probably won't, just because this is what makes it fun. So anyway, I was saying how you have been able to convincingly argue for your perspective, and I don't mean argue in a pejorative way, but make a case for it and to convince a congregation, group of elders, pastors. But what's the awkwardness of, I guess, maybe flesh out, like, give me your, like, if in a perfect world where you had allies and advocates functioning well, and you also had people with the freedom of not having to advocate for themselves if it was going to bring emotional trauma or whatever other negative things which exist. I mean, I know that, it's like, do I really have to make this argument again? I'm sick and tired of it. What does that look like? I mean, how do we get to that point where, like the Twitter rage happens so quickly, where people can jump onto, being angry about some of these things so quickly without maybe allowing space for this tension, where you have allies and advocates, but you also have people who are also able to help process people through different scenarios. I mean, do you think that there's any ways to do that well? I guess maybe in a local church. Let's put it in that context. How can we do that in a local church context? And think about that for any topic. Women in ministry, social justice, politics, which is a huge challenge for the church now. But even the way that you're going to do kids ministry, or I don't know. There's probably millions of different scenarios where you have advocates and allies. And then you have people that can also make their own cases. Like, how do you see a really healthy way for those two issues to kind of intersect and interact with each other?
I think it's best done in relationship and in community. So that's what I don't like about social media, is that you can just be like saying stuff and it's not really based on much relationship. Yeah. But I think the more relationship you have, the more you can actually be heard. So if you care about changing people's hearts, then you'll invest in the relationship or build the trust, however that looks. Yeah. Speaking up for the sake of speaking up, in my opinion, has marginal value. In love, with trust, with giving the benefit of the doubt, then you're more likely to win people over.
That's genius. That's really good. So speaking up just for the sake of speaking up is not very fruitful. It's just
squeeze, blow people off.
Yeah.
And just say, oh, you're at camp or whatever.
Yeah, I think you're right about it. It's funny how, people get behind one of these keyboards here.
Yeah.
And get real brave. Yeah. In fact, this is totally probably to my shame, but I love those videos on YouTube where it's like a dude shows up at somebody's house and they're all like G'd up and gangster, and they're like, "You were talking smack," like the guy's like, "I was just kidding." It's like, I think they're funny comedy videos. They're not real, but I'm just like cracking up because guys like, "Yeah, you want to fight? Let's do this." And then the other guy's like, he's hiding behind his keyboard. Yeah. I'm like, I know how that goes. Wow, that's really helpful. Though I think that that seems to be so often the answer is relationship and communication. Like you said, it's kind of funny because that's just really kingdom. That's really the way Jesus modeled things, and I think we see the fruit of that, but it's social media has made it really challenging, and the disconnectedness, and now with COVID-19, the pandemic, the disembodiment of many of our relationships, it's been challenging, right? Like, in your context, you're still quote unquote doing church virtually and online because of the need to do that. And, in other communities, we've been in person for a while. We still have a lot of protocols, but it's awkward still too, because even though we're kind of in person, there's still there still is that barrier because of masking, and it's just, yeah, it's weird. But it's also kind of interesting because it raises all these embodiment questions of what does it look like to be a community and to have relationships, because my ecclesiology is definitely not to the point where I would say that you have to meet in person, to be a real church, or, like you have to be able to do the, kiss each other on the cheek like Paul commanded. Okay, so you talked about being an Asian American, a Korean, and I want to talk about Asian culture a little bit.
Okay.
I have I think I told you, I'm 25% Japanese. I have increasingly felt like, especially since the quote unquote, and I'm not at all saying this but the use of the phrase China virus has been extremely hurtful, very damaging to Asian Americans. I have many friends who have shared stories, and it's really interesting because, I will cry if I talk about this a whole lot, but my grandma was, probably one of the most important people in my life. And so to think that people would be, hateful to her based off of her being Japanese is like, beyond. I mean, I'm not mad anymore. I'm just hurt. It's like hurtful. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we still live in a world where that's like a thing.
Yeah.
But we do. Like, that's the thing. It's like, even though it's uncomfortable to talk about and it's hurtful, it's the reality that we live in, and it's something we have to process through. So, so I've been thinking a lot about that. Being an Asian American in America has its challenges, because oftentimes when it comes to ethnic diversity conversations, from my perspective, it seems like we talk a lot about black and white, and we also will talk about the Hispanic, Latino cultures and peoples and white, but Asian Americans are like, oftentimes it feels very much like they're left out. 25% of me feels very left out. Okay. And so I guess, let's talk about that a little bit. What's it been like, because in the Bay Area, there's actually a large Asian American community, different parts of the Bay Area down where you live. And I had the pleasure of going to this really beautiful church down in Berkeley. I think it was like maybe 2 years ago, and it was a Baptist Asian church that does campus ministries, and I was blown away. And it was this thriving church environment, very missional. I mean, they were so I was blown away. It was phenomenal. But what's that been like, as an Asian American? And do you see it that way? Do you see that there's like this, I don't know if it's unwillingness, but it just hasn't happened. There hasn't been a lot of conversations at the forefront of society and culture about Asian Americans and their challenges they have living in our country. Like, do you see it that way? And flesh that out. Give me your thoughts, because I know you probably have a lot, being that you're Asian. And I assume that you do.
Yeah, I definitely think that even within our Vineyard movement, it can feel very black and white. And I understand why many people's entry into the whole racial reconciliation, multi-ethnic kingdom of God conversation or conviction, it can first be a black-white experience, depending on where you live, in the South, in the Midwest. I mean, in certain places, it is very black-white. That's who's there. And I think we're lucky in the Bay Area that it's automatically not black-white because, well, actually, we don't have very many African Americans where I live, but it's just very multi-ethnic. We have South Asians, we have Southeast Asians, and you're able to differentiate like, wow, these are really different cultures.
Yeah.
So, so I feel aware of that. Like, hey, are Asians part of the conversation? Is there a sense of like, oh, the issues aren't as intense with Asians, so we'll get to that later? Or is there a willingness to see, wait, how are our Asian brothers and sisters suffering as well? Because it can be a little bit more invisible or not talked about, but it's there. And I know it's there because I grew up in a very white context where I was very, very aware of being an outsider. Which I might not if I had grown up here in the Bay Area.
Yeah. But outside of the Bay, I think that's why that's something that we do need to talk about, not just in the Vineyard, but I think in most church contexts, because yeah, it's one thing to go to the Bay. Like I go to the Bay and I'm like, wow, I am literally the only white person here at all, and and it's like it's very fascinating. But then when we lived in the Midwest, we lived in an area of Wisconsin where there was this huge Hmong community because, after the Vietnam War, there were several places in the U.S. that were primary locations for immigration to have happened. And Eau Claire, Wisconsin is one of them. And then the Twin Cities has a huge Hmong community. And what I thought was fascinating about this, and this kind of goes back to the women in ministry and patriarchy, is it seemed like, and it sounded like, in the Hmong community, it would be almost impossible for a female to be the pastor. It just because it was such a patriarchal society. Yeah, and it there were churches that were totally egalitarian in their denomination, but they had to be patriarchal or complementarian, and just in function. And I think they were trying to disciple people into the kingdom, and then through that, they would give voice to women, and hopefully, over time, the next generation would have a different perspective, maybe. And I just remember reading about that and talking about that with some of my friends who were in the Hmong community. What I think brings up though is that how, like any ethnic group, there's not one monolithic Asian perspective, or there's how many Asian countries and ethnic groups. And I think that's kind of been probably part of the challenge a little bit too, because and I'd love to have your comment on this. It may seem like different Asian ethnic groups experience persecution or oppression or overlooking in different ways. Because it seems like if you're from certain countries in Asia, it's good. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, you're a ... Yeah. And then other countries, it's almost like, oh, it's frowned upon. Is that true, or is that have you seen that or experienced that or heard about that?
Absolutely. I think that vague sense of an embedded affirmation of light colored skin is there in many cultures, but in my Korean experience, my sister and I had really pale skin, and growing up in Oregon, where getting to lay out in the sun was a premium, we thought that was just so sad. We were like, oh, we hate that. We don't. Yeah, our skin is so pale. But then we went to Korea and to visit relatives, and literally the aunties, random aunties that I didn't know, would touch my skin in the elevator and go, "Oh, it's so white," and that was a good thing to them.
Yeah.
So yes, so I think, I don't know how I picked this up, but a sense of maybe Southeast Asians, Filipinos with darker skin, that it wasn't as good of a thing, or, that hierarchy that comes with light skin, dark skin. I definitely sniffed that evil, that fallenness, even with my upbringing and in various Asian cultures.
Yeah, it's interesting because I like Japanese people. I've always kind of, my observation, and maybe this is because of my own, but it seems like Japanese people are okay, they're in the U.S. they're welcomed, or they're I don't know. It seems less pejorative, or you don't hear as at least I haven't, and maybe it's because of I would feel like I would be really sensitive to that too, because if I ever heard anybody use terms, I'd be like, what? That's me, or that's my grandma, that's my dad. So Southeast Asians, you've observed there's almost like an embedded bias culturally?
Can be.
Gotcha.
I did have that. I wrote a blog post about how one time in high school in Oregon, my friends and I went to this dance in this other town. And at that time, the norm and what I was used to is me and mostly white people, or almost completely white people. So we went to this dance, and there was a grouping of Southeast Asian guys my age, and they had darker skin, and they looked like maybe they were Cambodian or Thai, or I don't know, Southeast Asian, and asked me to dance. And I remember being really self-conscious and uncomfortable, and more uncomfortable than if a white person had asked me to dance.
Interesting.
And
wow,
I don't know if that was like I was just gotten used to being more comfortable being the only Asian, or I was just uncomfortable with the Southeast Asian looking people. Now, ironically, my son is Cambodian, Vietnamese, and Lao. You know, I just think he's like the most handsome kid in the whole world. The thought that I was asked to dance by someone who looked like my son at my son's age now, and that I was looking down on him because he had darker skin, just makes me want to throw up. But somehow I had picked that up, or somehow it came together in my mind. Like, I don't want to be associated with this guy. That's just,
that is interesting. Yeah, I think about that too. So this is what I think is interesting. So I know enough about history that Koreans and Japanese people oftentimes don't get along. And I also know that it's because the Japanese people were naughty, evil, bad. Okay. Like very well aware. I'm like, that's a part of Japanese. That's I'm 75% white.
Identify.
Yeah. Like, that ain't me. But it's fascinating how my grandma growing up, I would hear from my grandma and my grandpa at times like negative stereotypes about Koreans, but yet my grandma, most of her friends were all Korean. And because she worked at duty free in Alaska, it was like 110% Asian people working at duty free. And so it was very, very interesting how I saw, because I remember like trying to reconcile that. And I feel like maybe I still am trying to reconcile that, or try to understand how, because I think this is probably indicative of a lot of people who hold to racist or ethnocentric perspectives or worldviews or frameworks, but aren't always racist in their actions, I guess is the best way to say it. Like how, well, we can generalize a whole entire people group, but you're different. You know, like, I mean, because I've heard it before about African Americans, like, well, African Americans are ... but you're different.
But I don't think it's that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I mean, I think white. I mean, I've heard that too. Like when I used to have a lot of my friends at certain periods of my time were people of color, and it was always like, well, yeah, white people, blah blah blah. But you're different. You know, it's like
thank you.
Yeah, I was like, I always like 25% Asian. That's what I always try to pull out. I'm like, I'm with you. Yeah. So yeah, it's just interesting how the complexity of, and I think that's probably the issue, or the reason why conversations like this are so important, is because when we really analyze, we have to be willing to look at ourselves too and realize that we need to put all of our perspectives on the table.
Yeah.
And especially when we're following, well, even more so when we follow Jesus, right? Because we need to get to the point where we don't have like no trespassing signs on different ideologies or different perspectives. We need to say, Jesus, you have full range to critique my intended biases or unintended biases or perspectives on things. And I think when we do that humbly, we can actually find out that we hold things that we didn't know were prejudices, or we were just ignorant of that. Because like racism is interesting. I've really been trying to figure this out because of my kids. Like I still struggle with I have a hard time understanding how those views can still exist. I really do. I know they do. And I don't mean that in a naive, like, well, I've never had to deal with it. I've seen it my whole life. But I just have a hard time in 2021 that we still have people treated terribly and evil because of the color of their skin. Like that's so hard for me to wrap my head around it. But it's interesting how many times my kids hear things, you know, when they're 6 years old, and my son's heard things from students at school that are racist. Where did they learn those things?
Yeah.
Where did they learn those things?
Well, the system. I mean, things are set up in such profound ways that it takes forever to come to see. And it's not just bias. I mean, bias is everywhere, definitely. I grew up in my Korean culture having tons of bias, as I was just talking about. But I would say every country, but especially this country, there are systems set up that propagate those kind of things, those attitudes. And it is shocking when we see that even children pick them up. And it is, when people say that, I'm like, where did you learn this? How did you pick this up? And it may be parents or other relatives or adults, but also they pick it up within all the nuances of our systems.
Yeah.
Media.
Kids are sponges, right? And I mean, they're soaking all these. That's helpful, because I was thinking about parents. Like, that's where I was going with that. But fascinating that you would say, because obviously you see it on social media.
Yeah. But even who works at McDonald's, who does this job, who does the cleaning, who does, who are all the administrators, who are the
who speaks at my church.
Who speaks at my church, that kind of thing. That modeling, the power of modeling. Pick that up.
Do you, with the Asian American cultures that you are, or if assuming you're observing them a little bit, because you're in the Bay and you kind of have to, I would assume, because it's all around you. But do you feel like, because a lot of the Asian American, or a lot of the Asian cultures are patriarchal, just like a lot of cultures all over the world are patriarchal, been like that for a long time. Do you see that unraveling a bit with the next generation? Do you, because like when you were growing up, it's fascinating. You're growing up, you just assumed, oh, that must be the Korean thing. I'm not that. I'm not. That's not who I am. But do you see that becoming less and less of an influence amongst Asian American, followers of Jesus?
Good question. I'm not sure.
You need to speak about all Asian Americans right now. I realize I just asked you a question that's almost impossible to answer.
What do you say about this? I think it is true that as like second generation immigrants are here, they are more used to the individualistic, egalitarian American norm. So having men in all the leadership roles feels weirder to the second and third generation than the first generation. And the other thing I want to say is that just because Asian American communities tend to be a little bit more patriarchal, it doesn't mean they're fully patriarchal. And what I mean by that is that just because the pastor is a man doesn't mean that church isn't really run by women.
Yeah.
Because some of them are functionally matriarchal, even though.
Isn't that the case for like most complementary churches?
Yes.
I mean, statistically, it's far more women.
Yeah. So even in the church I grew up with, I saw women lead because the leading needed to be done. So they're the ones who, got the permits for the thing at the county fair, and they ran this and that and the other, and we had women doctors, so you all see those things being modeled as well. So there can be like a thin veneer of patriarchy, but then there's all the rest of the stuff where we just need all hands on deck because we're surviving.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I recorded a podcast with Edgar King, who is a vineyard. So he's an African vineyard pastor in Kenya. And we were talking about that, about how I was curious about, like, in the African context, because it's very patriarchal. Like when I've gone over there, I've been in Kenya probably 7, 8, 9 times with that. And I remember I did a marriage conference one time, and I was teaching what arguably would be egalitarian perspective of marriage. And it was like all these Kenyans were just like, what? So, but it's interesting because even in the church culture there, even amongst people who would say women can do everything, it's still very patriarchal. And so that's that gender knot I've talked about in multiple podcasts now, that unraveling it and trying to wrestle with all those cultural things that are embedded in society, like bringing those things into conversation with the kingdom. So it's interesting because he was saying how I think we boiled it down to colonialism is really the issue, is like, and the African church was not complementarian until complementarian Baptists came and told them what they should be, or missionaries. Yeah. And I'm not trying to say Baptists are bad, but it was interesting. He's like, yeah, until we were told that we couldn't do that, women had been very involved in the church that was here, right? Because that's the colonial way of doing things. The church is already there. We go there and we tell them that it's not the real church, and we, you need American buildings, and you also need to wear suits and ties. It's crazy. But so there's an author, and I'm pretty sure he's Korean. Soong-Chan Ra? I've never actually said his name, but did I say it right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love his work. But he talks about in the book, The Next Evangelicalism. I was just thinking about that. He talks a lot about the challenges with second and third generation Asians. That's one of his case studies, and how the identity, it's finding your identity in the Western culture is really challenging. And I think this is probably part of that conversation, because I've seen it with Latinos. Like, it's interesting how depending on what generation or what age you're talking to, a lot of Latino friends of mine, like, there's a fair amount of Mexicans, they're Mexican ethnically. Their parents immigrated to the U.S. and would not let them learn Spanish. Like, they're like, nope, you can't. You need to become an American. Don't learn Spanish. And then it's like the third generation rediscovers, in a sense, their cultural heritage to some degree. So they learn Spanish, and they're kind of like, oh yeah, Cinco de Mayo. And then it's like the fourth generation, and these are just anecdotal, but my observation, the fourth generation's like, wait, not only do I need to learn my language and my heritage, but it's also okay. We can celebrate my culture, and it's not just Cinco de Mayo. It's going to be all these other Mexican. Just speaking about the Mexican culture, because I know there's a lot of different Latinos and Hispanics, but it's like it's really cool to see that development. But it's also interesting to understand how that development happened, and I feel bad for that second generation who was kind of like told, don't be what you are.
Well, it's because a huge part of immigrant culture is just surviving.
Yeah.
It's
so sad, though.
It is. It is. But, as a second gen, or they called me 1.5 because I was born in Korea and I grew up here. I feel like the gift I have is, now that I'm older, I realize that people have had to do so much to survive. And when you go to a country and, all your background, all the skills you have in your background, your education, it doesn't matter anymore. It's a tremendous amount of creativity, ingenuity, to survive. And that is something that my parents modeled for me. My mom and dad, they stay up at night cleaning apartments for $10 an apartment, all that. And that is a gift. That is, it's grit. As much of a gift as if my Korean were better, even, and they sent me to Korean school or whatever. Well, actually, I did go to Korean school. I hated it, but still.
Funny. Well, I think that's a good counterpoint. Because that's exactly. I'm not trying to mean that I'm throwing shade on the second generation from the first generation. I'm saying it's more so. It's sad that our culture couldn't have back in the 50s or 60s or whatever. I don't even know what year it was, but like, we couldn't have been more willing to see. And this is the whiteness Christian, or not. It's not. It's tied to Christian nationalism, but it's like that whiteness thing. Where we are really willing to celebrate certain cultures over others, because and where I lived in the Midwest, a lot of Polish and Norwegians. So there's a lot of places having polkas. You should laugh. You should laugh. Polkas. No, it's not. It's not. There's nothing that should be celebrated about polka. I want to go on record as that. No, not real. It was like, well, this is really interesting. Like, we, in this culture, Now, partly it was because there's a lot of Norwegians and Germans and Polish people in this environment, so they were able to. But I would also say, and I think you could make a pretty strong case for it, is that there's certain cultural heritage that in the U.S. are like okay to celebrate out in mainstream. It's like it's cool, and then there's other ones where it seems like let's just hey, whoa, you're in America. You need to leave that stuff behind. And, and I guess it's hard not to tie that to the color of skin, because it's like Europeans tend to be able to be because in our country, and this goes to the bias issue, mainstream America tells a story where we're a melting pot in parentheses of Europeans. But we're not a melting pot of Europeans only. We have all these other people, like in our community, there's lots of Latinos. I mean, there's that's a significant part of our community. And it's hard not to recognize that as part of that bias, and that the system is built up to celebrate certain cultures and to devalue and not celebrate other cultures. And that's too bad, because in my experience, like all these cultures, I mean, as much as I'm throwing shade on polka dancing because it is so ridiculous, it's actually really fun. And, like going to it was like, this is amazing. You feel like you can do that in front of people and be okay. Like, that's amazing. Good for you.
And the dress.
Yeah, exactly. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
And I think how that continues is because of poverty. I mean, there's definitely the class or socioeconomic element of that. When most immigrants, when they come over, they don't have time to be creating cultural centers and festivals like that. They are surviving.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So, okay, tell me, how do we as a society, actually, we can't figure that out. How do we as the church? I mean, I understand like one of the intended or one of the things we can intentionally do in that case is to work towards serving those who are in socially economic disparity, or have poverty or are food deprived, whatever it is. That's one thing the church absolutely can do. Are there other ways we can do, like the cultural center? Use that as an example. My favorite thing I've ever done in Africa, ever, to me, it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Was at this Vineyard conference. It was a 4-day long conference. And I was telling Edgar this. I was like, you guys need to do this every night. Like, don't sing American Vineyard songs for me. Like, we need to do something different. And one night they did Africa night. And so they've got, I don't know, in Kenya, I think there's 42 different tribes with unique languages, unique cultures. So there's all these different tribes doing worship songs and their dances. And it was so beautiful, like celebrating their cultures and seeing in the room, people were like, this is what I loved about it. Every tribe was excited not only about their own culture and being able to share it, they were celebrating all the other tribes' cultures and languages and dances too. Like it was the kingdom on earth. It was one of the most beautiful things. So is there a way for churches to be able to do something like that, to become a cultural center? Because back in the day, churches used to be, Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses on the door of the church. Why? Because that was Facebook. that was the way to get it out there. Yeah. What can we do today? And maybe, like as we're dreaming here, do you see this as something you might try to do down in the Bay Area in 3 years when COVID's gone, or whatever it would be?
Well, I have a theological answer and a practical answer. I think as a person of color who leads a church that was founded on primarily white culture, we have to teach from the scripture dominant culture people, or white people in my context, how letting go of being comfortable is so crucial in the kingdom of God, and letting go of things that you don't even realize. I guess the common language now is privilege. Letting go of cultural privilege is a mandate for Christians who are trying to live out the kingdom, either because you're a missionary or because you're trying to receive and be as hospitable as possible to all types of people. Because unless you realize that, then there's just going to be all these different ways that celebrating different people's cultures isn't going to make sense. So, for example, in the early years when my husband and I were just members of our church, I noticed that all the potlucks, they like to have a theme to the potluck. Themes were all like European,
Yeah.
So,
hot dish. This week we're having hot dish. Tater tot casseroles.
Pasta, And so I think, but as a minority person, I wouldn't say, let's do Korean stew, because I'm not feeling safe. I'm not feeling like the white people are going to understand or have a reason or rationale for welcoming that.
Yeah.
Because they're like, no, we're not doing our culture. We're just doing normal stuff. They don't understand that.
They never had Colby ribs.
Right. Exactly. And it's so sad.
They just don't know.
So
I know. Hey, on a total side, I know I want you to get something. I got my grandma's Colby ribs recipe from my mom recently, and I was like, oh, so good. It's
that's great.
So good. I know I didn't mess it up. I added the right amount of brown sugar. That's the one. This is a lot of sugar. Okay, keep going. So you are like, you didn't feel safe, or you wouldn't feel safe in that environment to celebrate your culture, because it's almost like it hasn't been the awkwardness stage has never been approached.
Yeah, and it needs to be a value first before really as a minority, or like there's only a couple of us or something like that. No, that's not true about our church. Our church is like 40% Asian, but in those early years, I wouldn't have shared my food. If it was, the chances were highly likely that people would be like, ooh, what's that? That smells really different, or whatever. So I think we have to create a culture, a foundation of eagerness and gladness, in dominant majority. So, and I think we have to, on a practical level, we just have to try and experiment. So, when we were still meeting in person, we would have friendly fourths. So on fourth Sundays, everyone wore their name tag, and then we had special snacks. And so we would just try, like, okay, we're going to have Indian snacks today. We're going to have Korean snacks today. Or, the Brits are going to bring like chocolate from England, which was so much better,
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Things, say. That's a kingdom value, because what you're doing is you're helping people to have a foundation of stretching. And that is so important, and it builds trust with those of us who are the minority.
So that awkwardness, I want more comment on that, because I'm thinking about how, so I went to Nepal a couple of years ago, and we were fortunate to stop in Hong Kong, and I had like a 24-hour time. And so me and my friend were like, we are going to literally just eat food for the next 24 hours. And we did too. It was bad. COVID 20, we did the Hong Kong 15, and then we did it like in 24 hours. But I remember this one soup place. It was, it was just all these different soup kitchens or soup restaurants or whatever. And the smell was out of this world different. And, I would have said bad. I'd have been like, whoa, that was like, whoa. But then I ordered this soup. I was like, cause I have to try it. Like, I just have to. So I ordered this soup, and it smelled very like dirty feet. That's I was like, this is dirty feet soup, but it was awesome. Like, the taste was phenomenal. And we ended up like sitting there, and we ordered like 2 bowls of it. And we were just like, what is this soup? So there was this awkward, because like I was like using the word weird to describe the smell to the others. I was like, it was just weird. Like, I don't even know how to, how do like in that case, is just a kind of the food thing. You talked about having to be uncomfortable and how to be weird. Like, how do you navigate those things when there's things that are so new to different? Because it's not just white folks. I mean, I think if you put Africans and Asians together, because a lot of the African people I know they'll joke around about how people think they all look the same, but then I'll be like, yeah, well, it's like black people saying that Asian people look the same. Like, it's kind of the same Same thing. How like you talk about the value in the kingdom where the value is to explore different cultures and to value different cultures and to be willing to have, I don't know, that awkward stage, or have the uncomfortability. That's I guess awkward and uncomfortable those are kind of similar. What's that look like in the church? Like, how would you see that happening? Like, lay it out for me. Like, you're a church, you're going to start doing potlucks and you want to get to the point where you can get that Colby rib. Okay. Like, my goal is to get Colby ribs. And if you bring kimchi, even better. How do you get there?
I think the secret is relationship, authentic.
That you can't go with that answer every time. It's too easy. Okay.
True. It's like your example of going to the soup place in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
I think that's great that you had the initiative and the adventure spirit to do that. But even better if there is someone from Hong Kong who was help you to navigate, to know that this kind of soup was meaningful for their mom, that kind of thing. And you might even stretch to try something that you normally wouldn't because this person's asking you to. So
gotcha.
That's why it's great to have as much diversity in our churches as we can, because it's really through relationship that you're more likely to say, oh, I will try this, or whatever. So, food.
Well, that's funny you mentioned that, because the reason why we got this soup is because, this is, now I remember this. We found this guy who owned this. He was out, I think he was eating, or on his lunch break, so he was eating a bowl of soup, and we were clearly the two white guys, in this building, and we're just kind of like, it was just soup shops all around. We were like, where do we even go? And he started just talking to us, like, where are you guys from? And so he's the guy who's like, hey, come have soup at my shop, and this is the one, and so it was very relational, because I didn't know. There was literally 20. It was one of those squares, like a mall, food court, and it was like, where do you even go?
Yeah.
Where do you even go? So yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't even thought about that, because we would have not picked that soup. Like that had been the last one. Mm-hmm. So that's good. So, but it ended up being like like I said, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the best soup. That's amazing. Wow. Well, I think that the whole idea of the racial awakening in America, and also it seems to be happening a bit in the church, is really good and really exciting. So I don't know. It just seems like the more conversations like this, and the more that we can get coaching from people like you, and not just like you, but yourself, it's going to be really helpful for the church. So what's some ways that people can kind of stay up to date? I know you have a website, which if you're listening to this, it's in the description. And if you're watching this, then you can see the link right there. But tell me a little bit about what you write on and you blog about.
My blog is not about church or racial things, or it's just one of my passions, which is capturing my stories about my son. My son has autism and intellectual disability and a number of other things, and he is not able to tell his own stories. So when I turned 40, I just decided, okay, what do I want my 40s to be about? And I realized, well, I'm not sure, but one of my goals is to make Joshua known, also to make Jesus known, but to make Joshua known. Yeah, people would know who this amazing kid is. So I just decided to capture stories about life with Josh.
Awesome. So people who want to,
it does overlap with race some, because I'm realizing many things as I raise a Southeast Asian child. But also about just being a special needs parent, and having siblings, typically developing siblings, and
I'd love to have you. So I was before we went recorded. Today I'm also recording a podcast with a scholar who specializes in the church and disabilities, and we've been working on this podcast we've actually spent more time preparing, as you know. It's like, hey, you want to be on a podcast? Cool. Let's talk about some things. but we've been working on a variety of different things we want to address in the podcast, and I'm just going to ask her questions from a specialist perspective, who is a New Testament scholar, but also very passionate within the. She's Australian, and she's done a ton of work to try to help the Anglican churches in her particular city and in her community become more inclusive to people with disabilities. Which my story, my youngest sister has Down syndrome. Because I've had her in my life for the last 22 years. I've been very aware of that being something that the church hasn't always been great at. The church in general, And so I was wondering if you might be willing to. We record this podcast. We give you a copy of it, you check it out, and then we could have a follow-up. I'd love to have you unpack some of the things that we talk about and have you share in your experience, because I know, again, Susan, like from outside, we don't know each other really well, but I'm like a fan. I don't know, I'm a Susan fanboy, if that's a word that they're still using. But I just really appreciate your thinking. I mean, you're so thoughtful and measured and wise, and it seems like you've thought about a lot of the different subjects that we're talking about. And today we just scratched the surface on these, and we could talk forever on some of these things. But so I would love to have you be on another episode to kind of flesh out more of the thinking on the disabilities, challenges for the church, because that seems to be a significant issue for us. And so I'm going to have you close with one final thing. So the other day I was in this Zoom meeting with a bunch of different pastors, and my friend Brian Metzger, who's a vineyard pastor on the East Coast, put this thing together about the church of the future. Like, what's church going to look like? And it was interesting because there's a number of churches in this meeting who are in your same situation, where there are no in-person meetings. They're in cities that are still highly susceptible, lockdown, the whole 9 yards. And then there were a couple of us who were like, yeah, our numbers have been going down. We've been meeting in person. We've been trying to do that as safely as we can, but we were all kind of talking about what is 2022 and the end of 2021 look like, and we all see that there's been a massive failure of discipleship in the American church context. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. I hope. But one of the things that one of the pastors pointed out was how their church is next to a church that has intentionally said, hey, we can't keep up with the mega church down the road that has, a $50,000 budget just for their technology. Yeah. And part of me was like, oh, that's high. But what we can do is we can start to identify different people groups or different issues that no one's addressing. And so they have, because I think what it was is that one of the co-pastors has either a child who has a disability or works in a disability environment in their bivocational role. And so they were just talking about how their church has really taken that on. Like, they want to be more intentional about that. And I was really convicted about that, because when we first moved to Red Bluff 4.5 years ago now or so, that was because we had been a part of a church in Wisconsin that was very intentional about that. We had a fair amount of people who had disabilities, and several people we had this married couple that had Down syndrome or have Down syndrome that were the cutest couple in the entire universe. Oh my gosh. And because of my sister and whatnot, but we were pretty intentional. And here we started out 5 years ago wanting to do that, but it just kind of hasn't been something that really has taken off. And what I realize is that I have not been as intentional here as I had in Wisconsin because of a variety of different reasons, mostly because I've been busy with all these different things. But I do feel like the stirring of, hey, we need to do something. So if you wouldn't mind, just for a few minutes here, help us know, for those of us in the church that we're leading or we have some influence in, what can we do to begin to be more thoughtful about people who experience cognitive disabilities, physical disabilities, even mental and emotional. I mean, mental and emotional, challenges are real, and we've seen, more focus on that in the last probably 5 years than ever before. what can we do to get in the game? And then maybe this can prep us for our next conversation where you can, if you'd be willing, unpack some other really helpful things for us to do.
I think that one low-hanging fruit in terms of mission or opportunities to serve for the church is the reality of super stressed out parents, right? You know, when the pandemic is over, if you can say it will be over, I don't know, when we come out the other side, we're going to have a lot of people with mental health issues, and we're also going to have parents who have just been hanging on by their fingernails for way too long. And that's especially true for parents of special needs kids. You know, I mean, not every church is going to be able to have programs for those kids themselves. If you can, that's great. But that takes a lot of volunteers and work and, you know, program energy. But you could have a circle. We have a circle that we call extreme parenting. And it's just a support group for parents with, I mean, a lot of kids have different special needs. Could be as overt as my son Josh, or it could be kids with mental health issues or, you know, nutritional, I don't know. You know, every child has special needs in some way, but if they identify as special needs, then you can guarantee that those parents are extra stressed, you know, and almost too busy and stressed to ask for help. So any ways that you can offer help, practical help, but also circles of support and knowing for those parents, I think that would be awesome. And I recently received that, and that is God's grace to me in such a profound way. So
awesome. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know, you know, you have, like every other pastor in America, I'm assuming you have a very stressful life and are busy, but deeply honored to have you. So to everybody listening and watching, thank you for taking the time to do this and to listen to this conversation. Yeah, we really appreciate your time. Check out Susan's website. There's a lot of great stuff that she's doing. And also, Susan, your church, you have podcasts and videos, and you're doing that. Like, how can they follow you? Because that's a great way to actually hear you.
Yeah, we have a YouTube page, channel, and Palo Alto Vineyard Church, and our website. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Thanks a lot for being a part of it. And all you listeners and viewers, thank you for your time too. Have a great day and peace out. Woo!